Version 3.2 of Empire War Expanded Thrawn's Revenge saw the introduction of the legitimacy mechanics to the Imperial factions, and the response to them has been really positive. In version 0.3, we're taking that government mechanic to its next phase by tying Imperial regimes directly to it, especially with Dark Empire. If you've played versions of Thrawn's Revenge prior to 3.3, you're probably familiar with eras. These are 7 different time periods covered by the game, represented by 7 different Imperial leaders, which determines the time period of the game not just for the Empire itself, but for everyone else as well. Generally, the progression here happens by the Imperial player either voluntarily choosing to progress, the Imperial leader being killed, or 60 in-game weeks passing. Point 3 is making some significant changes here. First, other factions will no longer have all of their progression tied to the Imperial leader. Instead, while your starting regime is still decided by the era or year you start in as the Empire, time progresses independent of the Imperial leader. Some events will still be based on who's leading the Empire, but time and regime, beyond the start, are no longer locked to each other. The first thing this means for regimes as a government mechanic is that the 60-week limit per leader is now gone, so you can theoretically stick within one particular regime forever if you so choose, without that meaning every other faction is stuck. Secondly, a new Imperial regime has been added as an alternative to Isard when progressing from Sate Pestage, the Central Committee of Grand Moffs. Whichever of these two between Isard and the committee that you choose will become your leader, each with their own unique elements and forces, and with the forces of the one you don't choose becoming independent on the galactic map, based on Typhera for Isard and Kessel for the committee. Sate Pestage's death or Coruscant being taken in this era will default in leadership falling to Isard. From here, both options progress to Grand Admiral Thrawn, similarly to how it worked in prior versions, but this is where we start getting the major changes introduced via legitimacy. Rather than legitimacy just being a way to integrate other Imperial factions, or to attract smaller groups of heroes to your cause, it's now also more of a competition between Imperials to prove themselves worthy of the reborn Emperor approaching them from Biss. The main Empire no longer just gets Dark Empire as the next step after Thrawn, they have to earn it, and any Imperial Warlord faction can beat them to it. When an Imperial faction has integrated at least 2 others, which could include integrating one faction that's already integrated another faction, Palpatine will approach and give that faction the option to form Dark Empire. In the future, you'll be able to turn down this offer and someone else will form it if you want to play against it, without giving up future progression, but for now it sticks with just the winning Imperial. Dark Empire brings an additional set of units and heroes from Biss to join whoever forms it, including Palpatine himself, his powerful flagship the Eclipse and its related superweapon-toting design the Sovereign, Shadow Droids and TIE Droids, Hunter-Killer Probots, Dark Stormtroopers, Chrysalid Beasts, and more. This release will also see the return of the World Devastators and Titus Clev's Silencer 7 flagship. The World Devastators will not be built the standard way, and instead will upgrade and reproduce through their use in battle. We already had capturing Pokemon with boarding shuttles, so now it's basically time for evolution as well. A dedicated preview will be made to show off exactly how they work, so enough on them. Well, most of these bonuses will leave when Dark Empire ends, which will likely have an additional criteria put on it beyond the standard choice to leave or leader death, since it's meant as a power spike. But there's one other major difference with Dark Empire compared to prior regimes. It goes on top of your earlier leadership, rather than replacing it. So, you'll keep Thrawn, Delvardis, Zinj, or the Pterodok brothers, or Kane while you're in Dark Empire. Because of how the regime is formed, it also doesn't need to happen at a specific time. For the Empire, this could mean you form Dark Empire while Thrawn is leading your faction, but it could also mean you form it with Isard, Pestage, or the Central Committee. This means any extra units they lock or unlock won't change, but also means once Dark Empire starts, that set of progression is now done. You can't change from Pestage to Isard or the Committee, or from them to Thrawn, after Palpatine has taken over. But once Palpatine does take over, none of the further progression will remove whoever was in power from before. If you want to have Thrawn and his protege Pelion together, that's a thing that you can do now. And if you want to have the girl bosses Isard and Dala around, that's another thing you can do. If you want to keep the Denny's Early Bird Special represented, you can stick with Pestage and Palpatine. This can all have implications elsewhere. For the Empire of the Hand, this means potentially the ability to keep Thrawn around. As a result, there's many different permutations the game can go through depending on how and when these decisions occur. From Dark Empire on, progression proceeds similarly to prior versions, but for whichever faction has won legitimacy. You'll progress from Dark Empire to Karnor to Dala to Pelion, through leader death or voluntary changes or potentially other means. Because we don't want to interfere with the core rosters of the Warlord factions, or disadvantage one over the other, the later regimes will not have the same amount of unit locks or unlocks as before, unless especially appropriate. Instead, we'll be looking into other areas for leader bonuses. Some of the unlocked units within the Empire itself, which were tied to specific later game regimes, will stay with that faction and instead come through timed progression. The legitimacy winner will, however, become the beneficiary of any later research unlocks from upcoming periods in versions beyond Point 3, like the Turbulent Star Destroyer, which we showed off in the last EAWXCon stream. There's a few things we hope to accomplish with this new setup for legitimacy and changes to eras. For one, we want each faction to feel like they have more control over their own progression, rather than rushing through it by happening to have the Imperial leaders die elsewhere, or feeling like you may never progress because you just can't find them. Secondly, you want to make sure that the late-game Imperial content can still show up no matter who you're playing as. If you're the Empire, you generally get to see it, but as, say, the New Republic, if you eliminated the Empire itself before Palpatine came back, Dark Empire would always feel underwhelming, and in the future it'd mean content like the Turbulent would have just disappeared. This way we can tie it to whichever faction is around the longest and in the strongest form, giving it the biggest chance for the player to interact with it without having to play as the faction using it themselves. In some ways, this actually mirrors in-universe events as well, where the Pentastar Alignment's territory basically stayed around the longest and was the basis upon which Pelion built the Imperial Remnant. Finally, it adds a much better feeling of progression within a campaign that isn't locked to a specifically scripted event or battle, helping to give different mid-game goals for the player, giving them something to work towards or against aside from simply winning the game, and different reasons to target different factions. It should also hopefully feel like a more interesting way to progress than simply researching a unit when it becomes available. Ultimately, this is a goal we have for all of the factions, to have at least one of their government mechanics provide this kind of a long-term goal, ideally with its own flavor for each faction. Individual mechanics like the Command Staff for the New Republic, Pirates for Zinj, Chief of State options for the New Republic as well, the legitimacy unlocks that already exist, and the CSA's ship market have generally been pretty well received and work to give the factions a unique twist, but those ones don't give the same kind of long-term goal something like this does, so you want to end up with a mix of both versions for everyone. Hopefully that explains what the system does and how it works. If there are more questions, I'll be answering some comments, I'll have a pinned one with some frequently asked questions, and feel free to ask more on our Discord server linked in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.